Alright, here we go. This will be week 10 for the semester. Week 2, online, lockdown. The music you hear is probably not a song you've heard before. I'm playing it because it's from a band named Pandemic. So I thought that was appropriate for where we are right now. Alright, this is going to be criminal investigation. Chapter 11, and it's the chapter that has to do with working on crimes against children. And again, there's going to be 2 different PowerPoints that you can get on D2L that are going to look at these things and go in depth. I would encourage you to look at both of those prior to taking the exam you're supposed to take this week. And we'll talk more about the exam at the end of the video. When you're talking these crimes against children, understand that you as an investigator have a responsibility, number one, to protect the child. So even if the circumstance seems to be questionable on whether it's a crime or not, because the victim is young, because a lot of times the victims can't advocate for themselves because of their age, you need to take that role to make sure that everything's being done to make sure that this is truly treated as a crime, if it is a crime, or at least figured out to make sure that it is or it is not. Be cautious, though, that, you know what, little kids fall and hurt themselves. Little kids, when they're trying to learn to do things, get injured. It's not always neglect, it's not always abuse, but it's your job to figure that out. One of the things that always comes up with this when you're looking at cases, the appropriate level of discipline. Parents will tell you, somebody got injured while I was disciplining them. Any disciplinary action that causes an injury, a mark that you can see above and beyond just a red mark, is probably not appropriate discipline. But you've got to be able to take the time and the effort to try to figure that out. You can't just, hear someone complain and say, I saw this guy spank his kid in the grocery store. That's abuse. Well, I don't know, is that abuse? Or was the kid doing something that was dangerous to himself or not appropriate and he was being disciplined? So you've got to be able to try to work through that and make a determination on whether it truly is or not. Maltreatment of children usually falls into one of 2 categories. It's either considered an abuse case or it's considered a neglect case. Abuse can be sexual, can be physical, can be emotional. Again, today's society, be careful if you think you're going to make a case on an emotional abuse. That needs to be something that's a long-term, ongoing, over-the-top, emotional, negative situation. Okay? So be careful. That is definitely one of the categories. But you'd have to go to your own state and figure out what exactly the statutes say on what constitutes that kind of a emotional abuse case, and then build your case based on what the statute says. You can't just go by what people say. If you're building a criminal case, it's all about being able to prove the elements of the crime. And if you can't do that, you don't have a case. So go and find those out. Neglect is another one of those that make sure you look first at what the statutes are before you try to build a case on that. You may think a certain condition, a certain way of living is inappropriate, or a neglect situation. That's not what the court's going to always agree with you. Look at what the case says, the statute says, and build your case based on those elements to be able to try to prove them. If you look at it and you think, well, I think this is neglect, and then you read the statute and it goes, when you're done reading it, you go, well, the statute doesn't say that this would be neglect, then you have no case. Okay? Now, you still might make a referral to CPS, or you might make recommendations for counseling for the family. But if you don't have a criminal case, you don't have a criminal case. One of the reasons we look at these is because there's research that shows that children that are the victims of neglect or abuse have long-term negative effects. Physical, mental, emotional damage that'll follow a child into adulthood. There's research that show kids that get physically abused have a higher chance of being criminals themselves and being violent criminals themselves. So these are situations that not only do you want to solve the crime now, obviously, because you want the abuse or the neglect to stop, but you also have an obligation that this could have long-term effects for the victim and for society in general. Some of the major risk factors: most physical abuse takes place children under the age of 4. Special needs kids are of higher risk. Kids that are in a family situation where there's substance abuse problems. Poverty is always a risk factor. Now, none of those independently are enough to say, okay, this kid's going to be abused. But those are things we know from research that make that child a higher risk for those kind of things. When you're going to go into the investigation on these, make sure that you're first looking at, what do I need to do, first step, to protect this child? If you truly think there's an abuse thing going on, you think there's neglect going on, you've identified evidence, eyewitness testimony that seems credible, then you need your first obligation is to protect the child. Now, we know that there's negative related to child protective service. Kids that get taken out of the home, put into the foster system, put into child protective system. But if you've already identified evidence, excuse me, that a crime's probably being taking place, you have an obligation to protect that child. And that's what you need to do first. The next is you need to identify what crime you think has been taking place. Anytime you investigate a criminal matter, you need to go through, look at what you're looking at, and then identify what kind of things you think are going on. Am I dealing with an abuse case? Is it physical? Is it sexual? Is it a neglect case? What do I think is going on here based on what I've already established as evidence? We're not going to guess. We're not going to go into this with a preconceived notion. We're going to let the evidence guide us. But any good investigation is based on what criminal statutes are being violated. If the evidence says it's an abuse situation, a physical abuse, then that's the way you approach this. You approach your investigation like any other assault. That's essentially what a physical child abuse case is an assault. If you think it's a sex abuse situation, that would be a sexual assault. So you follow the rules of evidence based on a sexual assault case. And those are cases we already talked about in this class. But again, the only way you're going to make a case is you're going to look at the statutes, you're going to look at the evidence, you're going to let the evidence drive your case, you're going to process the evidence the way we've already talked about processing evidence. You're going to do everything as you normally would do for a criminal case. You're going to investigate it the same way. You're going to collect the evidence. You're going to photograph it. You're going to process it. You're going to interview witnesses. You're going to interview victims, if you can. You're going to interview suspects. Remember, though, that as you are trying to interview victims, the younger the victim, the harder it is to do a proper interview. They are considered not able to make decisions in our laws because of their inability to process things the same way an adult processes things. So your interview is hindered because of those factors. There used to be a school of thought that they'd bring these dolls out and they were anatomically correct, and they would do an interview with a kid and they would, point to things on these dolls and say, tell me what the bad guy is doing, where are they touching you and how. And they were making cases based on those interviews. Well, they found that to be extremely inaccurate, extremely flawed evidence, and most places don't even do that anymore because it was so flawed. There are some major cases that tried to be made by those things, accusing, child care providers with child abuse, with sexual abuse, that turned out to be 100%, bullshit. So you've got to understand that that is a huge obstacle to try to overcome when making your case. If they're so young, you can ask them some basic questions. You can try to get some basic understanding, but it's not going to be easy. And that victim's testimony is probably not going to be your best evidence. You better be able to corroborate everything else by physical evidence, by other evidence if you identify. If the only evidence you have is that victim's testimony and they're so young, that is not going to be good evidence for your case. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean you don't investigate. It just means that's an obstacle that you have to try to overcome. Be very cautious of an interview with a young victim that seems coached. A lot of times these cases are based on one parent trying to accuse another parent of wrongdoing, of criminal activity. If you sense that this interview, that the answers have been coached, be careful, because they're trying to make a case so that they get custody, so that the other parent is tainted moving forward in this divorce/custody battle. That again is not good evidence and not standalone evidence of any kind of abuse in a case. You better have additional corroborating physical evidence that says those things were occurring. If you don't, you need to be extremely cautious that maybe it's a false accused situation. Most of our statutes related to criminal Most of our statutes related to criminal child crimes against children, we also have laws that say that there's mandatory reporting laws. If you're a doctor and do an examination and see evidence of abuse, you have a legal, by statute, responsibility to report that abuse. Same with teachers, same with child care providers, same with nurses. And so a lot of these kind of reports initiate from a third party that has these obligations to report the abuse. Understand, they're reporting only what they are involved in, what they see, what they notice by child behavior, what the kid might say in their setting. So they come to school and the teacher overhears the kid making a comment about a situation that's taking place. Their evidentiary value is limited to what their experience is with that child. Now, it's probably a good starting point for your case, but is it going to be the only evidence and be able to move forward? Probably not. The least common abuse on children is sex abuse by an outside offender. Most sex abuse of children are done by friends or family, acquaintances. The younger the victim, the higher those numbers go up. When you're talking an outside pedophile, sexual predator of children, that's one of the more rarer things. But it does happen. They come in all shapes and sizes, all races and ages. They don't usually take children by force. They entice them. That's part of the game. They also try to be involved in common activities with the kids. This is the guy that, redoes his basement into a game room for kids to entice them to come in. Tries to be their friend. This is the coach, the trainer that is involved in child sports and activities. The one that works at the youth center, being involved in those activities. They usually try to find their victims through those activities, through those common areas. One of the things they're good at is manipulating and enticing these children. They're very good at evaluation on who is a suitable victim. Someone that's missing parental control in their life. The last area on these type of cases is child homicide, child death, based on neglect or abuse. You're going to deal with those cases similar to what we've already talked about, but now it's a death investigation. Understand, if you're talking a missing persons case or a death investigation case with children under the age of 5, research shows overwhelming your prime beginning suspects are the parents. That does not mean that there's not the exception to the rule. So don't get tunnel vision. But that is your starting point. And you're going to start there until the investigation takes you away from there. And it takes you away from there when evidence takes you away from there. Until evidence takes you away, they're still the prime suspects. All right, just some thoughts we got coming up in week 10. We don't have any activity this week. You still have a discussion original posts by by Wednesday, follow-up post by Sunday, and we have exam 2. It's online in the activity area under quizzes. You get 1 attempt. You get 2 hours to do it. It's an open book, open note, open PowerPoint exam. Once you start, you have 2 hours. 1 attempt, 50 questions, multiple choice. Enjoy it. See you later.